It began with something simple. A knock at the door. Just days before Christmas in Northern Ireland, two ordinary bank employees were about to become unwilling participants in one of the most daring robberies ever carried out in the United Kingdom. One of them was relaxing at home with family. The other was enjoying a quiet evening with his wife. Within hours, both men would be forced into a terrifying situation where every decision they made could determine whether their loved ones lived or died. Their instructions were clear. Go to work, act normal, open the vault, and hand over millions. No alarms, no resistance, no mistakes. By the time it was over, £26.5 million had vanished from Northern Bank in Belfast. It would become the largest bank robbery in British and Irish history. And even more astonishing, more than 2 decades later, the masterminds behind the heist have never been caught. This is the story of the Northern Bank Robbery, a crime so carefully planned that some people still call it the perfect heist. On a cold December evening in 2004, Chris Ward was at his home in West Belfast watching football with his family. Everything felt completely normal. Then there was a knock on the door. Standing outside was a man who appeared friendly and casual. He mentioned football and even brought up Celtic, Chris's favorite club. It didn't seem suspicious. Chris was involved with a supporters group, so strangers asking about tickets wasn't unusual. But the moment he let the man inside, everything changed. 2 more men suddenly appeared behind him. Within seconds, guns were drawn. Chris's family froze in fear. The men revealed they knew exactly who he was and where he worked, the Northern Bank Cash Center. Chris was told that he would cooperate with them for the next 24 hours. If he didn't, his family would die. This was a tactic known in Northern Ireland as a tiger kidnapping. Instead of robbing a bank directly, criminals take a victim's family hostage and force the victim to help them commit the crime. Chris had no choice. He grabbed his work uniform, stepped outside, and was pushed into a waiting car. His nightmare had just begun. About 20 miles away, another bank employee was about to experience the exact same terror. Kevin McMullen, a manager at Northern Bank, was sitting at home with his wife Karen when 2 men dressed as police officers knocked on their door. They told Kevin there had been a family emergency. He needed to come with them immediately to identify a body. Confused and alarmed, Kevin stepped outside. That's when the gun appeared. Inside the house, Karen was attacked and forced to the ground as a 3rd man entered the home. Within minutes, the couple were tied up and threatened. Karen was blindfolded and taken away to another location. Kevin was left behind, under guard. The message from the kidnappers was simple. Tomorrow, he and Chris Ward would go to work, and they would help rob the bank. If anything went wrong, their families would pay the price. The criminals had clearly done their homework. They knew the bank's layout. They knew the security procedures, and most importantly, they knew who held the keys to the vault. Northern Bank had introduced a safety rule that required 2 key holders to open the main vault. By coincidence, the key holders scheduled for the next morning were Chris Ward and Kevin McMullen. The kidnappers had selected their targets perfectly. Late into the night, the gang carefully explained the plan. Chris and Kevin would go to work as usual. They would act normal in front of co-workers and security staff. Later that evening, once most employees had left, they would enter the vault. At first, the employees were told they would remove £1 million and leave it at a bus stop. But that was only the beginning. The real robbery would be much bigger, far bigger than either of them imagined. The next morning, Chris and Kevin drove to work together. They tried to act calm, but both knew their families were still being held hostage somewhere in the city. Inside the bank, everything appeared normal. Employees were busy preparing for Christmas week, one of the busiest times of the year for banks. Millions of pounds were stored inside the cash center, the perfect target. Throughout the day, Chris and Kevin had to make several phone calls to the kidnappers to confirm that everything was going according to plan. Each call served as a reminder. The criminals were watching, and the hostages were still in danger. At 5 p.m., when most staff had gone home, the heist began. Chris and Kevin walked down into the underground cash center. Using their keys, they unlocked the vault door. Inside were stacks of banknotes, millions of pounds in cash. The men began filling bags exactly as they had been instructed. The first bag contained 1 million pounds in fresh banknotes. Chris carried it out of the building and placed it at a nearby bus stop. A few minutes later, a stranger arrived and quietly picked it up. Chris returned to the bank expecting the nightmare to finally be over. But then his phone rang. The voice on the other end said something chilling. "Good. Now go back and take the rest." The first million had only been a test. Now the real robbery was about to begin. Inside the vault were 24 large cash boxes, each containing hundreds of thousands of pounds. Chris and Kevin began loading them onto trolleys. The boxes were disguised with white security seals, markings that made them appear to contain waste paper instead of money. Meanwhile, outside the bank, a white van waited in an alley behind the building. One by one, the boxes were rolled outside and loaded into the vehicle. Even more shocking, a security guard stood nearby and watched the entire process. But because Kevin was the manager, the guard assumed everything was legitimate. Within minutes, millions of pounds were inside the van. Then the robbers returned for one final load. Bags filled with used banknotes, euros, and dollars. When the van finally drove away, the total amount stolen was staggering. 26.5 million pounds, the largest bank robbery the United Kingdom had ever seen. Once the criminals left, Chris and Kevin finally raised the alarm. Police quickly realized the scale of what had happened. The robbery triggered one of the largest investigations in Northern Irish history. Homes were raided, suspects were arrested, millions of pounds were eventually recovered during separate money laundering investigations. But the core mystery remained. Who had actually planned the robbery? Authorities suspected links to organized crime and even paramilitary groups like the IRA. But proving it was another story. Despite years of investigations, trials, and arrests, no one was ever convicted for carrying out the robbery itself. Chris Ward and Kevin McMullen were eventually cleared after police found no evidence that they had willingly helped the criminals. The Northern Bank Robbery remains one of the most extraordinary crimes in modern British history. 2 families held hostage, 2 bank employees forced to betray their workplace, and 26.5 million pounds disappearing into the shadows. Even today, investigators believe large portions of that money are still out there, hidden somewhere in the criminal underworld. The masterminds behind the heist were never caught, which raises an unsettling question. Was this one of the most perfectly executed bank robberies ever? Or are the real culprits still hiding in plain sight? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating crimes, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more true crime stories just like this. Because sometimes, the real world is stranger than fiction, and some mysteries are still waiting to be solved.